We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Jyoti Argade. She's the Culture, Diversity, and Belonging Manager at Autodesk. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Hi, Christina. It's so great to be here with you today. Yes, my name is Jyoti Argade, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And when I asked that question of myself, I think it changed. I think I wanted to be a spy. I even had a spy name. I think I called myself Crystal Emerald.
Oh my God.
I know, right? And I think it was just because I had this like nosiness, right? I mean, I'd like to say that it was just this restless curiosity, but I just wanted to kind of get a sense of what was going on and what was under the hood. And then in various periods, I wanted to be either a psychologist or a journalist, which in some ways are two sides of the same coin, but it's really around like, asking questions and trying to get to what the meat of the situation is, which is interesting because it's a lot of what I do now.
Absolutely. Believe it or not, other folks have said that they wanted to be a spy too, but no one has said that they have a spy name picked out. I love that. Very creative. And I know before we hopped on kind of recording as well, you talked about kind of your personal journey to this work and specifically Autodesk. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you into this diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work?
Yeah, well, I'm a child of immigrants who came over here in the 1960s. My dad was part of that brain drain, I suppose, but actually before the United States 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, but was recruited from one of the Indian Institute of Technology's, universities, and so came over in 1962 to start his PhD at UPenn. And my parents were raising their family in the midst of the civil rights movement in Pennsylvania. We're really dealing with those kinds of immigrant push and pull narratives of how to be American, how to hold on to their Indianness, so forth and so on. And in the 80s, my family found us in North Carolina. And I think that being in the 80s in North Carolina and being neither of a Black descent or being of white descent, you really find yourself in the cultural margins. I think that our family was maybe one of 50 Indian families within, a 40 or 50-mile radius. And so I think that, in that moment, I really started to understand questions that I needed to ask myself around identity, race, ethnicity, where I'm from. So I think that's really interesting that thread of those kinds of questions are still informing the work that I do as a DEIB professional. And then I was a dancer and then worked within the cultural arts sector in New York for many years and realized that I wanted to have a seat at the table and to have richer, more like culturally informed conversations. So ended up getting a PhD in performance studies at Northwestern in north of Chicago, and really geared myself to becoming an academic. Had the fortune of having a Fulbright in India, did some research projects there on contemporary and classical forms of Indian classical dance, and then ended up chairing a dance department in East London, UK, and we left right before Brexit. And I really reinvented myself. And I think the common thread was just looking at culture and trying to understand what are the practices, what are the mindsets, what are the behaviors, the attitudes, the histories, the legacies that inform culture. And now I work for the Culture, Diversity, and Belonging with the team over at Autodesk, which has just been like a wonderful transformative experience.
That's incredible. Well, number one, thank you for sharing your kind of personal roots and origin story as well into this work. There's definitely that common thread, as you mentioned, and I think it's so related to psychology, education, just that research as well. And I want to ask specifically too, a lot of folks kind of ask why you join a company, but I also want to know kind of you've been at Autodesk for almost 2 years. What has kept you specifically at Autodesk doing this work?
It's such a great question, and I am really excited about working with a company that has a lot of impact. It is a mission-driven organization. It has an effect on all different kinds of populations and communities around the world, creating software products and solutions with the built environment, within the architecture and, construction, also within media and entertainment. And, we work a lot with architects and designers. And so like wherever you are, wherever you're sitting, there's probably like Autodesk software that has imprinted on it, like on that bookcase behind you,
Yeah.
the way that the rebar is, has been constructed to create that building. So, so yeah, I'm really excited about that. And then I also am really lucky to work with an incredibly dynamic team. And the team has just like a range of different kinds of superpowers and skills, and we're all incredibly passionate about our work. And also, just the people in general, the culture is fantastic. People end up staying there for 10, 15, 20 years. Autodesk treats its people really, really well. And I've just been really inspired by the way that we've been taken care of during this pandemic in terms of the different strategic goals and visions that we have as an organization. And I have an experience of belonging at the organization quite like no other.
I mean, that's really important. You can tell when an organization, leaders, people managers really do care about you, especially in times of crisis, global pandemic, and over the past almost 2 years now as well. I do want to touch on the strategic initiatives that you talked about too, in terms of Autodesk's impact and how you think about measuring progress. Can you tell us a little bit about Autodesk's philosophy behind your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like a lot of tech companies and a lot of companies, multinational corporations, we have, some historic issues, I would say. And so, but we are committed to increasing the diversity of representation, not only on a demographic level, but also in terms of geography as well at senior levels of leadership. And we also have a very committed initiative to increasing representation of women in sales and in technology. So, so we're really excited about that. We're very much on track in terms of meeting our goals for women in sales and technology. And we also, of course, want to make sure that, we're partnering with our Black community as well to increase representation, like at all levels of the organization.
I think that's really critical in terms of all levels of the organization too. How do you think about measuring the progress of all of these initiatives, recognizing that we don't want to over-metricize, but just celebrating, what is working and what needs to still be improved upon?
Well, it's about accountability in the end, right? So, we have published our initiative and our strategic goals in our impact report. So it's completely public. And also the way that we drive accountability is by making sure that we understand, what the measures of success are. And so we do that through our, our insight survey, where we're looking at belonging. We're also looking at decision making. And then we're also ensuring that we are working strategically with our HR business partners, as well as our people consultants. And we have two fantastic strategic diversity business partners on our team as well, who are working critically with leaders and teams across the organization to help them meet those goals. And so we do that through learning, we do that through change management, that we do that through organizational development. And so it's a real combination of qualitative and quantitative assessment for us to meet those strategic ends.
Yeah, publishing your goals is definitely related to accountability, both internally and externally, especially for leaders of departments and executive leadership as well. I'm sure a lot of folks have feedback at your company, and employee listening is important. I want to know from your perspective, how do you see this culture of really employee feedback management and listening manifesting at the organization at large?
Well, it's such a great question that we pulse 3 times a year, and then we do, sort of local, like, surveys across the organization. But when we roll out a learning initiative, it is not just a learning initiative for one pocket of the organization. It is an enterprise-wide initiative, all the way from interns to individual contributors, all the way up to C-staff. And so when we do that, we look at our insight survey and we look at different kinds of hotspots. And so the first one that we did was very much based on psychological safety. And we correlate psychological safety with an expression of courage. And so we measure that literally as I feel free to speak my mind without repercussions. And so we launched an enterprise-wide initiative, starting actually with senior leadership, where senior leaders would be leading cohort-based conversations about how to actionably drive and foster psychological safety on their teams. And we were able to see increases in our insight survey where people did feel that sense of courage. We also did one that was on decision making, again, starting at the level of senior management to socialize that. We also socialized it with senior managers over in our sales organization, and then trickle that down to manager-led, facilitated workshops that would help them drive a culture of effective decision-making that had inclusive stakeholders that were brought in, making sure that we're bringing dissent into the conversation, having healthy debate so people could understand that they had ownership within the decision-making process. And again, we listen and we talk to people across the organization to understand, how we can do this effectively. So when we create learning, we do it in a very collaborative way. And we just came off of the belonging sprint and we launched, we call these sprints because they're enterprise-wide, immersive experiences where everybody is getting on the same page, sharing a common language, developing a vernacular, understanding that this is part of the water. And we're really trying to make sure that we're supporting and driving healthy mindsets and behaviors. And so when we did the belonging sprint, we did it on the back of being in the midst of a pandemic and realizing that, we're working in a really remote way, but we need to engage the paradox of we also have felt more connected. So how do we address that? And then obviously we had, a social reckoning, within this country, in the United States, that had an impact across the world with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many more. And so we needed to make sure that we had space to be able to have those conversations, to be able to drive with empathy, to be able to lead with curiosity and openness that everybody needs to have an experience of belonging, because we know that there is research that connects that to greater productivity, deeper sense of accountability, greater innovation. And so when we create these kinds of these initiatives, we do it in partnership with people across the organization.
I think that's so crucial in terms of psychological safety and a sense of belonging within an organization, just like company culture at large, right? It just doesn't happen. It's very intentional, it's strategic, and you iterate on that process. I do want to ask you around the creation of kind of these sprints and also just the initiatives that you are working on as well. A lot of times in these conversations, a lot of people and diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders talk about, this huge opportunity to involve creativity and, not do things business as usual. Can you provide an example of how the team has innovated maybe a more equitable process or a new initiative over the past 18 months to 2 years?
Yeah, I think that, well, let's talk a little bit about what innovation means, right? And I think that when we talk about innovation at Autodesk, we think of it very much as a value. And what that means is that we really draw on diverse voices and we harness the promise of that diversity in order to create a culture of innovation, to solve problems, to have healthy debate, to be able to, look at the key insights that we need in order to address whatever problem it is, whether it's a customer, whether it's for a team, or whether it's like an internal system that we need to take apart and examine. And so I would say that we've been really committed to driving a healthy culture of decision making. And I think that that has been an example of innovation in the way that we took a real human-centered design approach to it. So, people talk about decision making all the time. And we were very clear that when you have a healthy culture of inclusion, you also are going to have like a very healthy, robust culture of decision making. They go hand in hand. And so when we rolled out decision making, we spoke to our senior leaders, we spoke to frontline managers, spoke to teams to understand what are some of the issues that have come about with decision making. And so instead of doing some kind of like take off the shelf, we realized that specific to Autodesk, it's about how do we avoid consensus-based groupthink? How do we make sure that we're capturing and communicating those decisions, making sure that they're getting to the right people, so there's a level of transparency so people can have buy-in. Also looking at, who's going to be impacted by this decision and who has influence over it. So creating fertile, abundant stakeholder maps. So you're making sure that everybody has an experience of ownership in the decision. They may not be at the table, but at least they know that their insights are being integrated. And so I would say that that's been a real critical example. We launched the decision-making sprint in the late spring, early summer of 2020. And I kid you not, people are hungry for how to make really good decisions. And we created a product and a playbook and a platform, a virtual platform for people to, go through a learning experience that was facilitated by managers. And we just put out another call for a enterprise-wide facilitated experience that myself and another colleague of mine are leading. And within just a few hours, it was filled up completely. So we know that people want that. And when we see that people are hungry for it, we see that there's a real willingness for people to adopt a set of values that are key to, just really shaping a healthy culture where people feel permitted to have debate, but also feel couched in an experience of psychological safety and opportunities for a ethical and culture of feedback.
Yeah,
So.
I think that's really important also in terms of providing frameworks and resources so people do feel like they are part of the process. And also you're talking a lot about collaboration, having that ownership mentality. Something I wanted to ask too in terms of a healthy company culture is a lot of folks are talking about employee happiness right now. We know that a lot of people are thinking about leaving their jobs or switching careers, and the talk of the Great Resignation in the United States as well. Knowing that just like general happiness, you cannot be happy all of the time. What are qualitative and quantitative ways you think about measuring company culture or employee happiness?
I love this question. And I think the Great Resignation, as it's been said, is the outcome of a lot of different things. And I would say that it's really been an outcome of people taking pause, reflecting philosophically on what they really want out of their lives, right? And I think that that is such a profound opportunity for us to ask ourselves, like, how do we want to show up? And how do we want to live? And like, how might our work really nurture some of our own values and visions for ourselves and our families and the people that we love and care for? So I want to just sort of like place that we are super committed to making sure that our employees feel supported. And I think that the biggest one is flexibility, right? And so we all know that there's a lot of companies that are inclined to work totally remotely. Some are forcing their people back to the office, and we're sort of like, within the middle, because we understand that when people do come into the office and they want it, that they want to feel connected. They want to collaborate in person. They want to be able to solve problems. They want to be able to have coffee with each other in San Francisco, go for a walk around the block, and go to the market stalls to have some food, for instance. And then we also know that people want greater flexibility, and we want people to be able to have those kinds of opportunities opportunities to make those choices for themselves, as well as make those choices with their teams. And I've just come off of working on a flexible workplace program, set of support materials for managers and facilitators to take through with their teams. And it's really asking those questions of and leading with empathy and leading with psychological safety of like, what has worked? What has not worked over the last 18 months? How can we meet with purpose? Like, how can we make sure that we are mitigating Zoom fatigue and avoiding, inevitable burnout? How do we really make sure that we identify inclusive team norms so we can feel happy, that we can feel seen, and we can feel heard and have more joy, and know that our concerns as professionals are being taken into account, and coupled with like our own personal needs as well. So I think that those are all sort of indicators of making sure that people have greater agency and flexibility to show up doing the best work that they can. And so the way that we measure that is, we measure it through our insight survey. So we're asking questions about work-life balance. We're asking questions about flexibility. We're asking questions about, how they feel supported by their managers. And I've got to say that at Autodesk, that we've done really, really well. Our managers have been heroes in leading through this experience. And so yeah, we're totally on it, and we adjust like all of our learning and iterate on our learning in response to the insights that we receive from across the organization.
I love that agency is really important to the strategy and how you measure things, because nobody wants decisions made for them. Employees, humans are different, and just offering those resources, again, meeting folks where they are as well, and offering that flexibility is so important, especially recognizing the full, person outside of work is just at a different stage of life than, other coworkers as well. And everybody wants that personalized experience, which is really important.
Oh, absolutely. And you see it, across different geos, right? You see it, in different ways over in China, you see it in different ways over in EMEA, and you see it, different ways over in the United States, right? And then you also see it like in a very different way generationally. You see that, Gen Zs, want to have greater flexibility. They don't only want to be working remotely, they want to come in the office. And then you see people who are a little further on in their careers is that they want to have, fewer days in the office perhaps, but, it's so contingent as well on as where the person is in their lives. And I know that this wasn't part of the question, but I think that, as a DEI professional, well, for all of us, we have to be really clear about the kind of biases that might surface, as we're navigating this moment, making sure that we're driving, for opportunities of inadvertent mentorship, where, we're not necessarily having those conversations in the elevator lobbies or, at the espresso machine. That how do we make sure that we are designing for making those kinds of interactions, as we're working within this hybrid moment.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to intentionality of design, inclusive design, and really proactively thinking about creating just like a thriving, people space and workspace as well. As you mentioned earlier too, there's a ton of research around when people feel like they belong at an organization and that they have an impact at the company as well. Their voice is heard, they're more likely to stay as well. And also it promotes innovation at a company too. In terms of company culture, sometimes people say, company culture is a more top-down initiative. It really depends on executives and people managers, whereas others say maybe it's more grassroots. Do you have a kind of philosophy around where company culture really stems from?
I do. And I would say that no one person owns it. And that being said, everybody owns it. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we try to do is that from the moment of that first interview throughout the talent life cycle, we really want our people to understand that there are so many different ways that they can contribute to the culture. And there are, simple ways of, thanking people through our rewards recognition platform, or making sure that people are being valued, or the way that people can participate in the sprints, or how we can operationalize our values. There's so many different platforms and opportunities for people to contribute. Obviously, joining an ERG, making sure that people are volunteering, having, opportunities to engage in mentorship programs, whether they're peer-to-peer, reverse, or traditional, opportunities to be mentored. So, so even though we try to establish our culture through stories that senior leaders can tell and that middle managers can talk about in terms of the successes that they've created for their teams, we want to make sure that we're driving the experience that that all of us have a part to play in the story of culture at Autodesk.
Yeah, everyone has the opportunity to be a culture conduit, whether you're a people manager, individual contributor, wherever you sit across the globe in the office is really important to make sure that they feel like, they're contributing to the company culture. And I think it comes down to behavior and, how you're modeling that as well. I do want to ask in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and of course, belonging work, your opinion on folks who are coming into this work. We talked about at the beginning of our conversation, kind of your personal journey to it and just lived experience. I have a similar experience as well in terms of being an employee resource group leader and just identifying with the importance of speaking about this, these topics. Do you think it's important for folks who are in the space to identify as a historically marginalized group on that personal kind of lived experience level?
I think that people come to this work in so many different ways. I think this work can be triggering. I think it can be exhausting. I think very often for people of color who are underrepresented or have historically been underserved or underheard, I think that there is there's often been an obligation for us to show up and educate others. And so I think that, we come to it in so many different kinds of ways. And I wouldn't want there to be sort of like a competition for, who's marginalized over another. I mean, that's where intersectionality plays in. And it's a strategic approach to understanding that, our privilege is dynamic and it crops up in different ways. I'm a very privileged, educated, person with, US citizenship. I speak English, but I'm also a woman of color. And so, there's been a few gates where it's been difficult to access that. And not necessarily at Autodesk at all. I'm just mean over my professional career. But I think the biggest thing in terms of doing this work is, having the passion. It's a values, mission-driven, aspirational, profession, right? And so whether we're coming at it from research, as I've come from it, or whether we've come at it from, working within social justice, or whether we've come to it from being in an expert in data analytics and knowing that that's something that you want to do, it really, really depends. I would say that start having conversations with professionals who inspire you, or with people who are performing roles that are of interest, to kind of get a sense of, what is the level of discourse, what's the kind of conversation that's happening? How is the conversation changing in different parts of the world and in different sectors?
Mm-hmm. You have to have a passion for this work. And I also appreciate your point of, especially as I'm seeing more diversity, equity, and inclusion roles come up from program manager level to chief diversity officer. You don't need this 20 years of experience specifically in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because, people come from this work in different ways, like you mentioned. And I would love to know, I'm sure there are many things that you are working on, but what's taking up the most brain space in terms of what's the next problem you're trying to solve?
The next problem that we're trying to solve right now is looking at how to acculturate, acquired companies. And so I've just come off of a pretty abundant project of looking at flexible workplace and supporting managers to lead teams in this hybrid moment. That work is ongoing. But the juicy problems that we're looking at right now is how to make sure that our acquired companies feel supported, and it's not just an integration where they kind of leave a culture behind and then just get consumed by the new culture, there's a real meaty, problem of looking at not just the operational side of mergers and acquisitions, but looking at the cultural side. How do we create a playbook for that? How do we ask the right questions? How do we engage, different cultures of decision making, manager enablement, the talent life cycle within those organizations, and how might we, see where the twains meet, so to speak, to make sure that there is a clear approach to listening and a clear approach to welcoming acquired companies into Autodesk culture. So it's more about strengthening the diversity, fostering the innovation, in order for acquisitions to really feel like they're part of the Autodesk family.
Yeah, I mean, that is a big, juicy, meaty problem to solve. I think, when we talk about new folks joining a company, in terms of a new hire class, everybody's bringing their new, their experiences with them. You could have the best company culture, but people could have like different things coming in. And I think when you're talking about acquisitions, it's a really large scale of doing that, and how you communicate and really set that up for success is important. I do want to ask another question in terms of just general trends you're seeing. So again, not at Autodesk specifically, but what are some common mistakes you see companies or leaders make when they're trying to lean into their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, even with the best of intentions?
Well, it's always a conversation. I just want to start there. I would say that doing this work is about fostering dialogue, about being open and being curious. And I would say that one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen is doing what is trendy rather than actually doing what is measured, what is data driven, and what is appropriate to the culture of the company, right? And and when it's trendy, we see that there's a lot of virtue signaling. There's a lot of pat on the backs. There's a lot of like one and done. We see like a lot of like social media statements, where we see commitments to the cause. But then, what is actually happening within the organization? And what we've seen, what I've seen like at other companies is that there's a bit of a dissonance that goes on. And so that's one. And then I would say two is that you gotta be open, and you gotta be curious, and you gotta bring people along. And so, there's gotta be a conversation about the why in order for people to be bought in. So that's a really big one. And then because I come from a learning background, so my job is sort of like part DEI, like learning lead, and then also part like DEI, like culture, diversity, and belonging consultant and business partner, that I would say that from a learning standpoint, is that there tends to be an over-indexing, within the LNOD, field of how to hold the majority, and how to help them feel good in having to grapple with these questions. And we've been incredibly sensitive at Autodesk in making sure that our underrepresented populations are being heard. And that as we're driving this learning, we're looking to them to help us understand that we're going about things in a strategic, inclusive way. But what I've seen with other organizations, and I've heard this like on a number of panels that I've sat on, is that it's often the over-indexing to supporting the majority while keeping those who are underrepresented sort of at the margins, which is not the right way to do things.
Absolutely. I was just talking to someone the other day as well, in terms of when you are conducting these kind of listening groups, or you're doing a focus group, or collecting kind of feedback from employees, you really have to look to see, okay, who feels comfortable giving feedback, who's giving it to you, what is their experience, are they in the majority as well? Because it is really important to make sure that people who maybe don't feel comfortable or are part of underrepresented groups at your company also have a chance to give feedback, and you're fostering that in different ways. So I love that. I think that's so important.
Yeah. And I just want to say that, all of these perspectives that I'm sharing is just like me as an individual. This is me like sitting on panels and doing, the kind of research work that I've done. And it's not at all like representative like Autodesk views on the matter. It's just what I as a professional have experienced over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely makes sense. And I appreciate you sharing your insights with us here today, just on kind of trends you're seeing, the strategy that you're helping to craft at Autodesk as well, and again, your personal journey to this work, which I think is really interesting. Is there anything that I either didn't ask that you want to share, or maybe one to two key takeaways you hope listeners bring with them after they listen to our conversation today?
Um, I would just say that, a lot of these concerns within DIB are triggering, and it's hard, right? And I think that it's really important, as Dolly Chuk says, drawing on like Carol Dweck's work, or even like as, in terms of Angela Duckworth's work on grit, is that, we really got to be ready to employ a growth mindset in all of this. And, we talk about, individual growth mindsets. We often talk about it in terms of, kids, and, Satya Nadella over at Microsoft, he has growth mindset as such a central value at the organization. But I think that what we need to start thinking about is, how do we employ a growth mindset as a team, as well as a company? And so how do we, make the implicit explicit, to really identify, what are some of the key issues that we're struggling with in a behavioral way, around these, issues of identity, and, fostering a community and experience of belonging, that we need to start asking ourselves, like, how do we as a team, grow into deeper awareness about ourselves and each other.
Absolutely, that growth mindset. And also goes back to what you were talking about too, in terms of this work being a dialogue, having a conversation, leading with empathy, vulnerability as well, and having that open mind. Jyoti, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. It was such a pleasure. And thank you so much for having me, Christina.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in that employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement to hear from all voices for the company to succeed. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.